That meant that during this time period, there wasn't a unified American way of looking at race. It's an idea in flux that hasn't fully taken root yet. While white Americans were arguing among themselves about what race was, what it meant to have communities that looked different, cultures that acted different, there were definitely communities of color in the United States. There's a tendency in history, in American history, to talk about the white community as though it is the only community, to say that Americans thought this and really be talking about white Americans. And I'm doing it some in this lecture. When I talk about Americans, I'm talking about this conceptualization of white America. There were also significant communities of color. Enslaved people had communities on their plantations, in their villages, in their families. Native Americans obviously had communities that in their homelands, in their governments, as I was talking about with the Cherokee. In these marginalized communities, leaders emerged and led the communities in resistance against the oppression of white Americans. The huge majority of the people who led these communities were men. Partly that is a reflection of the misogyny of white communities in general. It's also a reflection of historians saying, if we're looking for important people, they must be men. I'll talk about two African American men. The first of these community leaders is Gabriel Prosser. Gabriel Prosser was born in Virginia. He was enslaved throughout his life. He was trained as a blacksmith, and he was literate, which gaining literacy may have been a part of his training as a blacksmith to make it easier to carry out business. It may have been something that he picked up from children where he was raised. It was more common than we often think for enslaved people in the Revolutionary period to be literate. It wasn't until a few decades later that legislation against teaching enslaved people to read and write became very common. Another leader in the African American community who was concurrent with Gabriel Prosser but never met him was a man who was born in St. Thomas and then brought to South Carolina as a child. He was trained as a carpenter. He was also literate, and Denmark Vesey was, through his work as a carpenter, earned enough money to keep for himself that he was able to enter a lottery, which was very much like a lottery that we have today. You put some money in, you take your chances, and if you're lucky, you win some money back out of it. Vesey won this lottery, and it was enough to purchase his freedom. It was not enough to purchase the freedom of his family, so his wife and children remained enslaved, and he stayed in the South Carolina community in order to stay with his family. He continued to work as a carpenter. He became a leader among the Charleston, South Carolina community, and he was one of the founders of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. The African Methodist Episcopal Church is a denomination that was specifically created for an African American community, a Protestant denomination. One of the famous churches that was founded early on is the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and Denmark Vesey was one of the founders of that church. And finally, a Cherokee leader was John Ross, who was born in approximately 1790. He became the principal chief of the Cherokee, so the leader of that Cherokee Council from 1828 through to 1866, a very long time for any American politician to serve. One of the interesting things about John Ross is that his father was a Scotsman, his grandfather was a Scotsman, his great-grandfather was a Scotsman. He was descended from this series of Scottish traders on the Tennessee River. His mother was Cherokee, his grandmother was Cherokee, his great-grandmother was Cherokee. What this meant was that by white lines of descent, John Ross was considered and could frequently pass for a white man. He didn't bring up the fact that he was Cherokee. On his mother's side, remember that this is a matrilineal community, and so as far as the Cherokee are concerned, he's full-blooded Cherokee. His mother, his grandmother, his great-grandmother are Cherokee. And personally, he identified as a Cherokee. When he was young, he preferred to dress in Cherokee clothes and speak Cherokee rather than speaking English and wearing English clothes. His history is one of switching back and forth, of choosing a white persona when it served him. So when he needed to go negotiate on behalf of the Cherokee, he would take on a very white persona. When he was negotiating with other Cherokee, when he was living in his home with his family, he would take on a Cherokee persona. These leaders in their communities are evidence for us that the free white community is not the only community making rules and making decisions in America. Within these marginalized communities, leaders like these men, like John Ross, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, these men were able to organize groups of people to act on behalf of the entire community. As I said at the start of this lecture, by the time we get to the mid-1820s, there's a very clear racial line in the United States and a belief on the part of the white community that Native Americans and African Americans are intrinsically different and need to be treated differently than white Americans are. The last part of this lecture will cover some specific events that helped lead to the solidification of these racialized ideas.